my co-host today is Aaron Tomlinson. He's a former pastor, metaphysical teacher. He's a counselor, and he's one of my best friends. And we're going to talk today about critical race theory. And should we do it? Shouldn't we do it? What are the ins and outs of it? And all of that. And we're not just going to touch the third rail today. We're going to pee on that rascal. How about that? Sorry, man. I'm just being ridiculous today. But welcome, Aaron. And this is Phreology Friday also. So we're doing this live. So you don't know what's going to happen.
Thanks for having me, Derek.
Anyway, no problem, Aaron. I mean, this is for everybody that's listening on the podcast. This is a production that Aaron and I do together. So he's not really like the guest. He's, sort of like, we basically occupy the same space kind of spiritually and mentally. So it's not like he's really a guest. He's just, he's family. That's it.
Yeah.
Family.
Yeah. So what you drinking tonight, Derek?
Moscow Mule again.
I was going to get Moscow Mule, but I ran out of time. So I'm got a mojito.
Nice. Yep. Cheers, brother.
Cheers.
Yep. And I've got, as you can see, I have a lot of it. I mean, it's almost full.
I still wanted to get some, but I just ran out of time. Just ran out of time today. So I think you already introduced our topic, right? You already said we're talking about critical race theory. So why don't you start us off with your thoughts?
Well, cool. Basically, critical race theory is a construct that some legal scholars came up with that basically take on the structural racism that exists in this country. And it's not really a curriculum per se. It's not something that can be syllabalized. It's just simply a loose framework of thoughts that has been aggregated into this broad umbrella statement. And there's a lot of controversy about it because people are either really in favor of it or really opposed to it. And that's the third rail part that I was talking about. It's like one of those things in politics. They say that when you touch the third rail, basically you die, politically.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those third rail issues, but I also believe that it's something that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be discussed. And honestly, this is the just one of the many things that I love about you, Aaron, is that I can talk with you about anything. Mm-hmm. And we'll agree on most things. We'll disagree on some things. But the thing is that I know I can get a unbiased, I won't say not necessarily unbiased because we all have our biases, right? But basically, I know that there is no malice in your thinking.
Good point.
So I don't look for unbiased. What I look for is, is this person's opinion going to be harmful to me or others? And I don't believe that yours is. I mean, that's just something that I have a great deal of confidence in you personally.
Thank you.
But I think there are 8 states now that have legislation on the books to not teach critical race theory. In Carrollton, Texas, the first Black principal of a high school was fired because they believed that he was going to teach or authorize the teaching of critical race theory. And I think that there was a little bit more going on in his world because there were some honeymoon pictures posted on his Facebook page where he and his white wife were on the beach. And I think that was another thing. But and one of the things that we talked about before we got started is the conflation of critical race theory with other curriculums, with other agendas, and all of that. And it's not really the same thing. Like, for example, was it the New Yorker or the New York Times? New York Times developed this curriculum called the 1619 program, and it is a structured curriculum that they are selling to school districts or making available for school districts that basically teaches the history of the country with the ingrained racism that was inherent in the founding of the country. And so a lot of the people who are opposed to critical race theory, they're opposed to it because they're like, well, it divides us. And instead of uniting us, it separates us. But I'm of this mindset that if you have cancer,
Mm-hmm.
it's in your best interest to get diagnosed of the cancer so that you can be treated of the cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't know, you can't get treated. If you don't know, you might do some things to yourself that are harmful and will cause the cancer to spread. And so when I look at this country and its founding, the key principle is liberty and justice for all.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key tenet of this country, ostensibly. But that tenet was not made available to everyone. And because of that, there are a lot of cascading negative events that have sprung forth from that. So I think that now that we are in an age of knowledge, we're in an age of enlightenment. I really believe that.
Yeah.
That I think that the time is now that we deal with these things and and air it all out and figure out what is the way forward. So with all of that being said, before I kick it over to you, Aaron,
Mm-hmm.
I want to say this because I made a Facebook post maybe a month or two ago that said that if you don't support critical race theory, you can't be my friend. And that was a harsh statement, but I meant it. I meant it. I mean, with every fiber in my being, I meant it. But I have to sort of walk it back, sort of.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is I don't believe in teaching critical race theory. I don't. What I do believe is that we need to teach the history of this country, its highs, its lows, its goods, its bad, its smooths, and its warts, all holistically. Because if we don't, we have what we call, and I'm not saying this in a racial sense, but a whitewash version of history. Mm-hmm. And we don't need that. I mean, right now, we have an opportunity to move forward in a healing capacity. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want to talk about today.
All right. So, this, I don't know if you call it political cycle or the season that we're in right now. It's so crazy in this sense that everybody has an opinion, even when they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so, it was funny because you text me and said, what do you think about talking about what do you think of critical race theory? And I was totally joking. I said, I think it's trash.
Yeah, I figured as much, but even if you thought it was trash, I'm still good with it.
Well, but the truth is, Derek, I know what I don't know. And I know I don't know a lot about critical race theory because what we have going on, in my opinion, in the political arena with critical race theory right now is a straw man's argument. And most people that have an opinion about it don't know anything about it. They know it has something to do with race and they know it's a theory. And that's enough. And to me, that's telling, right? That's enough. Like, these people are getting all lathered up. They're passing legislation. They're fighting and arguing over this. And let's be honest, nobody, I mean, you might have, I certainly had not. Most people in our country had not heard of critical race theory a year ago or
Right.
2 years ago or whatever it was, right? So just the fact that we try to address something about race causes this much commotion is pretty telling about where we're at still in this country.
Yep.
On the race issue, because in my opinion, in my view, from what I understand, it gets conflated. So what I understand, as you said, critical race theory is a legal argument that some legal scholars put together to try to show systemic inequalities in this country, specifically in the justice system. And somehow it gets conflated with teaching an as you said, whitewashed version of history in schools. So that, that to me is really telling. So I'm approaching this subject tonight with some trepidation, but at least acknowledging I don't know what I don't know. I've never read a paper on critical race theory. I haven't talked to people who have really learned it in school or taught it. So I realize my understanding of what it actually is, what critical race theory actually is. But when we're talking about it, when people are talking about it, they're not talking about the theory necessarily. More than likely, or more often than not, they're talking about this idea that we don't want to teach what they would call anti-American sentiment in our schools. And I've heard the arguments, from that side. It's going, what is this going to do to the military? What is this going to do to people that want to sign up and serve if we're teaching this sort of anti-Americanism? Because we're talking about the dark side, the shadow side, if you will. And so the more I thought about this issue, we did a Phreology Friday a while back on American civil religion and compared American patriotism, radical patriotism, let's call it that, to religion, and it had a lot of similarities, right? And so as a former pastor, I know in the Bible, there was a bunch of stuff we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about the genocides. We didn't talk about, all the death and carnage that God caused for little things, like the guy in one of the places in the Torah who picked up sticks on the Sabbath, and God told Moses.
The first guy that violated the law, number 6.
Yeah. Yeah. And think about it, though, keep the Sabbath holy. And this dude just picked up some sticks,
And they stoned him to death.
Right. Like, where's the fences here with keeping the Sabbath holy? And, there's just all this crazy stuff in the Bible. And we never preached that stuff. We never put that stuff out to people because we wanted people to be persuaded. We wanted people to believe and to buy into our system that we were pushing. And so I ended up doing a series in church called The Shadow Side of God, where I looked at all these, atrocities, particularly in the Old Testament, that are committed by Yahweh or the God of the Bible, and said, we need to look at this stuff. And so for me, when people are saying, well, we don't want to teach, we don't want to talk about really in depth the issue of slavery and how it compares with the founding documents. We don't want to talk about the genocide of the Native American people. We don't want to talk about Japanese people being put in basically concentration camps in America, American Japanese citizens being robbed of their property and their land and anything that they had, and being thrown into concentration camps and then being let out and saying, well, there you go, with no reparations. Right. And so what it exposes is the foundational philosophy is all men are created equal, or liberty and justice for all, but it wasn't for all. It was for white Europeans that had come and settled in the country. I mean, that's absolutely what they meant. Or at the very least, they would have given slaves voting rights.
Right.
So we have these concepts like democracy, where the majority gets to choose, government of the people, by the people, for the people. All people are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights to pursue life, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we didn't mean all.
Right. All means some.
Basically, it was sticking a middle finger to Britain and the Britain monarchy and system and setup of government without maybe being completely thought through in terms of really human inalienable rights. And so if we want to say those are our founding principles, then we have to look at this stuff. We have to address this stuff. And we have to not be so afraid of giving people who think differently than us a seat at the table. Because if we don't, it's not democracy, it's fascism. Fascism is we want everybody to look the same. Nationalism, everybody, marches in step. Democracy is everybody in all of our diversity comes together to try to figure out how we can live together equitably.
Yep.
And either that's our principle or it's not our principle. And so if that's our principle, then why can't we talk about it? Why can't we teach history accurately in schools?
And that's the actual point there. What does it take to teach history accurately?
Right.
That when we talk about history, that we talk about the slave rebellions, that we talk about Harper's Ferry, that we talk about the Trail of Tears, that we talk about the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, and all of these things, and what is the global impact to the country? Not just because here's the thing: people want to say that, well, when we teach these things, what we're going to do is we're going to paint all white people as the bad guy, and try to tip the scales in favor of minorities. And that's not an accurate retelling of history. Doesn't do that. It just simply says that, okay, if we're going to be intellectually honest, that this country was built on some principles, or it was built on some principles but did not honor all of the principles, and the result of the failure to honor some of these principles is the reason why the country is the way it is. I had an interesting conversation with a guy on Instagram, and he said to me, he said, dude, I never owned any slaves. My parents didn't own slaves. My grandparents didn't own slaves. Nobody in my family tree owned slaves. He said, everything that I got by the sweat of my brow. And that kind of feeds into the whole American exceptionalism, rugged individualism, that mindset. But even more to the point is this, that if you are white in America, you benefit from a lot of the policies that were enacted. Even if you yourself, that's like there's a town in Long Island called Levittown, and Levittown was sort of like the granddaddy of communities with racial covenants for home ownership. So even though the housing was affordable, even though it was in reach of a lot of, Black GIs particularly, the covenants kept them out. Meanwhile, the property values in Levittown continue to increase and increase and increase, which is building wealth for the residents of Levittown. Meanwhile, Blacks, because of redlining and things like that, they're not able to build that wealth. And this is part of the story that needs to be told, because yes, a lot of white people, I have another friend who is a first generation Ukrainian American. In other words, his parents came over from Ukraine. He was born here in the US. I think he was the only one of his siblings to actually be born here. And he accurately says, well, Derek, we came over here after World War II. My family came over after World War II. I never had anything to do with any of that. Well, that's true. But like another example, Dr. King had pointed this out in one of the speeches that he gave before he was assassinated, that the Homestead Act gave land grants to a lot of um, uh, Northern European immigrants that came over from Norway and Sweden and Finland, and they settled in America. And not only did they give them land in the term of land grants, they have what you call land grant colleges. So they built a system of education in the form of public universities that helped to educate them. And all of these things were given to people that came after slavery. And none of these things were done for the freed slaves. And so those are the kind of things that, from a historical standpoint, that need to be taught. And I'm going to say one more thing before I kick it back to you. It's like um, things like the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yeah.
I didn't learn about that until not only was I an adult, but I had completed 7 years in the military and 5 more years of civilian job experience. I mean, I didn't learn this right away. This was something that and when I learned about it, I was like, holy fuck, can you believe this? Well, there, as it turns out, Tulsa is not a unique situation. There are many other U.S. cities where there were race massacres. The riots in Detroit in 1967, which that was I was born in Decatur, Illinois, and my mom and dad separated, and my uncles drove us from Decatur, Illinois, to Detroit, Michigan, in the middle of the riots. We arrived there July 3rd, 1967. And I still remember to this day the tank parked in front of my grandparents' house.
Wow.
You know, so, true story. But these are all things that, and what sparked the riot in Detroit was an act of police brutality. That was what was the origin of it. But again, if these things are not considered in the American historical narrative, then nobody really knows. Okay, they'll think that these things, that Tulsa happened in a vacuum, that Detroit happened in a vacuum, that Los Angeles happened in a vacuum, that Newark happened in a vacuum, and it didn't. These things, there was some cause and effect, and it was not an individual event, but it was a culmination of events over time that caused them. So again, I'm going to say this and I'll shut up again. Is that, listen, if we can leave the terminology, critical race theory, let's just take that and put it on the shelf and leave it for the academicians.
Yeah.
Let it be handled by the eggheads. That's fine, right? All of the lawyers, the scholars, all of that. Let them debate that. But as far as in the schools go, let's take that off the table and say, how best can we make sure that an accurate historical narrative is brought forth in the schools? And I believe that if we do that, see, the other thing that people are afraid that, like you mentioned, maybe people won't join the military. People will hate the country. Listen, let me say this for the record. As bad as America has treated Black people, I love my country. I love my country. I served it in uniform. And if I were younger and, stronger and all of that stuff, I'd do it again, gladly. I wouldn't change a thing. And as a matter of fact, I think that I'd do more than what I did before. And that's knowing what I know now, which a lot of this I learned after I got out of the military. Right. So it's not going to create any negative effect. what it's going to do is it's going to cause this country to look at things realistically. And uh, man, I'll save this point to another time. Go ahead, Aaron. I'm going to kick it over to you.
I think you make a great point that none of this stuff happened in a vacuum, right?
Yep.
And I was talking to a guy yesterday, actually a black guy yesterday, and we were talking about some of this stuff, and I was just sharing with him. Now, for people that don't know me, I've come full circle. I mean, I grew up in rural farming, Colorado, eastern Colorado. There's, I think 2% of the population in Pueblo County is black. I had one black person in my high school that I knew, two black people in my high school. And I didn't know them. They weren't my friends. My grandparents on both sides were Barry Goldwater Republicans. So, it was, and, we did I was taught all the great stuff about our country. We always had the flag out on Flag Day. I mean, celebrated 4th of July. I mean, you get the picture, right? I'm as white as they come. I actually haven't done my DNA yet. So to be fair, sometimes I've said I have, but I'm misspeaking a little bit. But my mom did it. My sister has done it. And in both cases, they came up 98, 99% white European. So I realized that my family line was committed to keeping the bloodline pure, right? The genetics pure. Yeah. I mean, that takes some commitment, right? Yeah. I'm like one of the only people I know. It's like 98%, probably white. And so I'm just trying to give people an idea of, what my background has been. My grandfather. So I was talking to this guy yesterday, and I was saying, I definitely grew up with the typical white privilege, in the sense that my grandfather was born in 1899, by the way. I just want to say that on my dad's side. He was born in 1899. So what? Wow. 30 some years from the Civil War.
Yep.
So I think people need to realize we're not talking about a big stretch of time here generationally.
No.
And so they came out to Colorado. They started an agricultural business. My grandfather and my dad are in a Colorado history book thing that we have. My grandfather was the first one in this region and area to have $1 million business. Wow. So I grew up around that kind of stuff. My grandparents on my mom's side had a dairy farm and ranch with hundreds of acres. And I was talking to this guy yesterday, and I said, it was unthinkable that I wouldn't go to college.
Yeah.
Because all my relatives went, my siblings, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, it's just what we did. And that shocked him. And he was talking about it. He says, my great grandfather was a slave, Mm-hmm. My grandfather had nothing, basically. And he kind of went through what his genetics were. And so let's talk about pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's one thing to start on an equal footing and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But we're talking about, in this case, a highly unequal footing. Now, it isn't just black people that have experienced this. Now, the slavery part and all of that, yeah. But most of my Latinx friends in this area, they were the they supplied the their parents and grandparents and great grandparents. Many of them, not all of them, many of them supplied the workforce for the white farmers, and the businesses. And I know a lot of my really, truly, Latinx friends that grew up in Latinx families that kept their line pure. College wasn't on the radar for them either. And I'm not saying that college is the end all be all of success, but I'm just saying those are when I was coming to terms with, okay, I do have privilege. Those were some of the things that I had to look at. That, you know, culturally, I was a byproduct of my culture, and culturally, we were set up for success, and other people culturally were not set up for success. Now, does every white person come from a family that's in a history book and had $1 million business? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not the case. But let's consider this. There is a sort of subliminal narrative in the country about white privilege that I saw in movies, that I saw on television. You know, I think back to what was popular when I was growing up, the Fonz, you know,
Happy Days,
Richie Cunningham, you know, the typical quintessential white American family and population and culture. Star Wars, you know, I mean, you're making a movie about aliens. You could make them any color. You can make them green if you wanted to, you know, but and so those are the things that people don't appreciate. We have some Asian American friends that are Pacific Islanders that live next door to us, and we've gotten to know them pretty well. And with all the craziness that's going on with that group because of the xenophobia that's been created with Asian people in our country and the violence that's been perpetrated presently with them, they went and took a concealed carry class. And it's heartbreaking to me that they felt like in my community they had to go take a concealed carry class, number one, for their own safety. But number two, they said when they were in the concealed carry class, every person that was portrayed as the quote unquote good guy with the gun was a white person. And many of the people that were portrayed as the bad guy with the gun were people of color, especially Black. And those are the things that sneak in to our thinking and our consciousness that is a part of having white privilege in this country that we don't recognize or see or ever even talk about. So here's my point as it relates to teaching history. I'll tell you one more thing, Derek, and then I'll bounce it back to you. But the other day I was taking my oldest son, to school, and we don't talk a lot. I don't talk a lot of politics at home. I talk a lot of politics and stuff with you. I post stuff on Facebook. But, you know, for the most part, we're definitely not talking that with our kids and you know, around the dinner table and that kind of stuff. But my children are observant, and one thing we have done on purpose and just through serendipity is they have been exposed to a very, very diverse group of people, not only people of different ethnicities, but people, you know, we just went to a wedding, a gay wedding over the last weekend, and there was the entire LGBTQ, what I call alphabet soup, because they keep adding letters to it. And it was wonderful. It was such a good time, you know? And so they're being exposed to that. But my son, on the way to school, he says, Dad, he says, I don't like the American flag. And I said, why? And he said, because when I see the American flag now, I think of Trump. And he says, and I think about how mean those people are, especially to our friends, you know, who are people of color. And so he said, Trump and his followers have ruined the American flag for me. So here's what I want to say. That did not happen in a vacuum.
Right.
There is a historical context that leads up to that. But here's my point. My kids have not really studied history much. You know, they've looked at some stuff on YouTube and whatever, and they've educated themselves, and they've educated me on some things that I didn't know about. But they've done that of their own volition. And so they are struggling with this idea of Americanism and patriotism and pledge allegiance because of what's going on right now, Derek.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of the Trump followers.
Yep.
that they feel that and experience that at 10 and 11 years old. So this idea that if we go back and we teach history in the schools, it's going to make people not question their patriotism and hate America. You're doing it right now. You're raising a generation with all your foolishness. And I'm talking to my brethren.
Yep.
I'm talking to my people, right? You are creating it right now without teaching that stuff.
You know, a funny thing, I was a guest on a podcast earlier this week,
Mm-hmm.
and I was explaining how the Trump phenomenon basically brought me to a point of what I call functional atheism.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, I don't blame Donald Trump.
Right.
Donald Trump is not the cause of any of this. He's not the cause of my transition of spirituality. What he is a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was watching a video that Rachel Maddow did, and she said that she and her partner were at a baseball game, and her partner noticed a mole on her neck, and she said that mole is different, and she poked her in the neck. That mole is different. And so she said, oh, if you don't believe me, go ask your hairdresser, because she knows you. She's been doing your hair for 20 plus years. She would know. And she asked her hairdresser, and her hairdresser said, yeah, I was going to talk to you about that because that mole is different. And as it turns out, that mole was cancerous. But the good news is they caught it early.
Mm-hmm.
You know, early treatment or early detection leads to effective treatment.
Mm-hmm.
So Donald Trump is not the illness. He's that irregular mole on your ass.
Yeah.
That when you get out of the shower, you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you look to see your right butt cheek, and you see there's something there that it wasn't there before. And that is a symptom of something greater. It's not the illness itself, it's just a manifestation of it. And this is what I believe, is that when you teach history in a uniform, holistic way, the good, the bad, the ugly, that what happens is you're treating these parts that have been historically relegated to silence. And you're forcing a discussion of these things. So it's not going to make people hate the country, but it's going to help people to understand, how did we get here? And so I have an analogy. You know, Mario Puzo wrote the Godfather novels and the screenplays for the Godfather movies. Is Godfather 1, which was the story of Don Corleone and the passing of the torch to his son Michael, and then Godfather 2, which juxtaposed the historical Vito Corleone with the transition of the business from something that was Michael's vision was to make the business legitimate, but instead it got more violent, it got worse. And then Godfather 3 was
horrible movie, by the way.
it was, you know what? Here's the thing: a lot of people knock Godfather 3. I don't think it was that bad, because I think that the message of it was really very good. And that was that Michael's vision for legitimizing the business now is all coming to pass. But then you're seeing all of the hooks to the Catholic Church, you know, to other businesses and all of these other things, and all of these things are coming to pass. And the reality is that Michael now has to come to terms with the fact that he never dealt with the violent origins of his family business. And because he never dealt with that, this violence went on to, spoiler alert, wound up leading to his daughter's death and his death,
Mhm.
right? And that's America. Honestly, y'all, slavery, Native American genocide, misogyny, xenophobia,
Yeah.
um, all of these things are part of the American fabric. It's like if you try to extract any one of these things, the tapestry falls apart. But if we acknowledge that it's there and we embrace the flaw and simply say, okay, we're going to explain how this got here. We're not going to take it out, but we're going to understand how it got here and make sure that we understand how not to continue it. Then we can deal with it. But it's like the whole thing behind dismissing critical race theory as just separatist, I think really misses the major point. And again, I'm not in favor of teaching critical race theory. And also, for the record, as much as I support the 1619 initiative, I don't think that that should be the major curriculum. I think that it should be a contributing factor to at least high school history teaching. But what I'm saying is that unless we acknowledge, I mean, Condoleezza Rice, I keep going back to this one thing. She said that slavery and racism were America's birth defect.
Mm.
And I'm going to use myself as a personal example. And I said this in this podcast earlier this week. It's called the Empower Podcast. And you can look at it as M as in M dash power. But I was born with a birth defect. I had what was called a club foot.
Mm. Wow.
And so basically the foot is bowed. It's not flat. It's bowed. And so the doctors told my parents that the way to correct this would be to break my little foot
Mhm.
and put it in a cast. And after it had reset, then I would have a normal working foot. Now, here's the upshot of it. As much as I always say that I'm one of 5 black men in America that has no rhythm, I'm not a dancer, right? And I'm not a basketball player either. You know, 2 stereotypes crushed right there. But I did play football. I did play tennis. I did play hockey. You know, I was involved in a lot of different sports. But if I had not got that birth defect corrected, I wouldn't have been able to participate in any of those.
Right.
And not only that, I already had kind of a tough go of it coming up. And me and my older sister Sandy, we talk about this all the time because I'm fair skinned for a black guy, and I have light eyes. I have bluish green eyes, and so because of that, I had to fight to survive among the black kids that I grew up with. And then when I went to Minnesota to live with my dad, I had to fight with the white kids because I wasn't white enough. It's like I had a no-win situation. But the thing is that if I had not gotten that foot fixed, I would have had that to deal with in addition to everything else. And my life would have been horribly, horribly fucked up. As it turns out, my childhood wasn't really the most pleasant, but at the same time, I overcame, and I still am able to look back fondly on things. But had I had that to deal with, it wouldn't have been the same. And so by the same token, Michael Corleone was not able to fully realize his vision because he never dealt with the violence that was inherent to his business and to his life. And likewise, America, this is, and I'm going to say this is my parting shot with this, is that the reason why there's a big deal about the whole critical race theory thing is because America, and y'all bear with me here, America is a criminal enterprise. It was built on theft. It was built on extortion. It was built on abuse. Now, the principle, the guiding principle was liberty and justice for all, but that was not for everyone, clearly.
Mhm.
And the reason why no one wants to deal with this has become a third rail issue, is because people don't want to come to grips with the criminal enterprise that they know this country is. And here's the thing. You can start with a criminal enterprise and turn into something good. Do you guys know that most of the waste management companies in America have their origins in La Cosa Nostra? They have their origins in the mob. But these have, BFI, Waste Management, others, these are legitimate, law-abiding, above board operating corporations, but they have some of their history is tied to organized crime. The casinos in Las Vegas, a lot of this is above board enterprise, but it has its roots in organized crime. It's not to say, and basically, it's not to say that you can't take something negative and build something positive from it, because you absolutely can. You absolutely can. But if we ignore the negative, if we ignore the quote unquote sins of our past and try to sweep that under the rug and make that the silent parts, and then make it unproductive or impolite to discuss publicly, then what happens is these things just they keep. If, for example, if you're just sweeping dust under the rug every time you sweep the floor, eventually you're going to have this big mound of dust under that carpet, and the carpet is going to become infested with all that dust, and it becomes an even bigger mess. But if you say, okay, I'm going to do the extra work, the light work, the shadow work, and actually sweep this into a dustpan and take it outdoors and dump it into a proper receptacle, now I'm not going to have anything to deal with long term, because I've dealt with things in an in a realistic manner up front rather than expedience. And that's the point that I'm getting at. If you want to make critical race theory a non-issue, then let us commit as a nation to teaching the whole of history, all of the contributions. Because do you know that you were talking about Latinx farmhands, for example. You know that the railroads in the United States would not have been built without Black and Chinese labor.
Right.
And there is a slang, a cliche that talks about you don't have a Chinaman's chance. Do you know where that comes from? It was basically when they were building bridges, they would have to dynamite a bluff or a cliff to prepare it for the pierings for a bridge. And so what they would do is they would take the closest Chinaman that they could get and suspend them from a rope with dynamite. And they would light the dynamite, and the folks up top were supposed to pull them up before the dynamite exploded. And if he survived, he had Chinaman's luck. But if he died, which many of them did, he succumbed to the quote unquote Chinaman's chance. That is, and what I'm saying is, let's get past the Chinaman's chance. Let's get past the luck of the Irish. Let's get past all of the cliches and start treating all of this stuff as part of the fabric that makes this country what it is.
Yeah. We talked a couple of weeks ago about, again, I'm going to mention it again, and I know your podcast listeners or viewers didn't have the benefit of it, but we talked about American civil religion, and we talked about passing the immigration test to become a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, the next week, I got to talking to one of my friends who is first generation American, Mexican American. And she was telling me that she had made a phone call to her grandmother and dad, who, you know, took the path to citizenship legally to come to this country. And she was explaining more to me about that test, at least as she understood it from her grandma and dad, that they only ask you 10 questions, but it's out of a pool of something like 200 possible questions. And so they talked about how they studied with flashcards for months because you didn't know which one of the 10 questions was going to come up. And they could pick any one of the questions. They weren't pre-chosen. They were chosen as you were being interviewed or whatever, however this goes, to get your citizenship. So if there was something on your papers that they didn't like, they would pick up some obscure question.
Oh, wow.
To try to disqualify you. And anyway, she described this conversation. She talked about how emotional both of her parents became about how proud they were of her children and the life that they were making for them. And it was kind of like, you know, we sacrificed and went through all this stuff to come to America so that you could have a better life, and you're taking advantage of it. And in that sense, I think there is an honor that people who weren't part of our past, you mentioned the Ukrainian friend that you have, that they recognize the greatness and the potential greatness in our country, right? So I don't want anybody to walk away from this and think you expressed your patriotism. I don't want anybody to walk away from this and think that I, you know, hate America or any of that stuff. Because it's stories like that that inspire me and help me remember, okay, we've got something really special here. But here's the problem, Derek. As I was listening to you, and I love the analogy with The Godfather and Michael Corleone. But he had a vision to be legitimate.
Yep.
And our problem is we don't have a good corporate vision in this country to be legitimate. That's kind of where it starts. And look no further. So the Denver Broncos are playing the Las Vegas. I got to get used to it. They've changed so much in my lifetime. I don't know if they're Los Angeles, but the Las Vegas Raiders. And look what happened with John Gruden just this last week. You know, here's a guy in a position of power. 70% of the players in the NFL are Black. And yet the thinking and the liberality with which and frequency with which his opinions about Black people, women, gays, all the marginalized groups, right? Like I heard Stephen A. Smith say he was an equal opportunity offender. Like he offended Barack Obama. He offended the United States of America. He offended Black people. He offended gays. He offended
everybody.
Women. Like he didn't leave anybody off the list.
Yep.
So the truth is there are people in power in our country that do not have the same vision, the same ideology, and the same inspiration that you and I are talking about, that is what we believe can make America so great. They don't believe in the American experiment. And that's part of the problem, right? Because that stuff is still out there.
Yeah. I was looking at something where there was a doctor in Missouri that he had bought 40 acres of land outside of a town, and his land was stolen from him under the guise of eminent domain, but it was clearly racism. And this happened in the 1950s. You know, to put that in perspective, my older sister was born in the 1950s. You know, my parents were teenagers in the 1950s.
Right.
This is not far removed. And, you know, again, to sweep all this under the rug and to simply say, well, we're all equal and everybody has an equal opportunity and all of that is disingenuous. It's not intellectually honest. And if we can deal with that honestly and say, okay, it wasn't that far back
Right.
that blacks and Latinos couldn't live in a certain neighborhood. It wasn't that far back that the LGBTQ people couldn't experience the joy of marriage. It wasn't that. These are things that are with you and I. A lot of these things are things that happened in our lifetime. This is not even history. This is almost current events.
It is.
And so this is my takeaway or my call to action to everybody that's listening is to really consider the historical context of this country. And even if you don't want to go back to slavery, even if you don't want to go back to things like the Trail of Tears, because those things are many generations back, fair enough. But if we simply go back a generation or two or three, we'll find that there are things that are really close to us that have happened historically that have stunted the growth of wide swaths of people in this country. And if we can acknowledge, yes, this happened, and yes, it was systematic, and yes, even though I did not participate, I had nothing to do with it, don't even like it, but I know that I've benefited from it. If we can at least have that much intellectual honesty around this, then I believe that, to your point, Aaron, that we can develop a vision for what going forward looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, in 2021, this country is a rudderless ship.
It totally is.
I mean, basically, we don't have rudder or sail. We're just kind of being tossed as to how the ocean goes. And whatever ends up, I mean, and basically what happens then when you have no rudder, you have no sails, you have no ability to take advantage of prevailing winds, you have no ability to steer yourself, eventually you're going to run aground. Mm-hmm. And if we don't deal with this, and again, like I said, take critical race theory and put it on a shelf. Let the big brains hash that out. But for the rank and file, for the M1A1 American, let's simply say that, because here's the thing, a lot of these school districts that are, trying to 86 the critical race theory, they don't, I mean, in Texas, they even teach that slavery was not a heinous, reprehensible institution. There was something I read in a book where sometimes the slave masters would have a picnic for their slaves, and there'd be dancing and merriment. And no, even if that did happen in some isolated cases, that is not the institution of slavery. And to paint it like that is to be completely ignorant of the institution itself and its long-term effects.
It's condescending.
Yeah, so yeah, it is. But let's get back to my call to action is this. Let's figure out how can we discuss these things? How can we talk? And again, Aaron, this is one of the many reasons why I love you, is that we could just sit down, we could talk about all kinds of stuff, and there are some that we've dealt with some uncomfortable subjects, but the reality is that we love each other and trust each other enough that we can discuss these things, and we consider one another a safe space for the other. And so all of you who are listening, be a safe space for somebody. so that somebody can come to you and have an honest discussion about this stuff. Because guys, listen, gals, listen, that if we don't talk about this, it never gets healed.
Yeah.
Before any treatment can begin, a diagnosis must be made. And if we're unwilling to make the diagnosis, the treatment is impossible. And Aaron, you have the last word.
Yeah. So my call to action would be, I hope that we model for people. Like my biggest hope for what we do is that we model for people how to have these kind of conversations.
Yep.
You know, you and I have talked off air a lot. We
Yep.
talked about a lot of different things. There have been times I've reached out to you with my own processing through this stuff. And there's never been one time that I felt that you got defensive. There was never one time that I felt like there's this forbidden topic
Nope.
on the table. So, and I think a lot of people are afraid to have these kind of conversations, and they're afraid to listen and understand each other, right? So if nothing else, I hope we model this, because at the end of the day, that, you know, this will change. I believe it will change. We can speed up the progress, or we can impede the progress. And I think one of the ways we can speed up the progress is by having conversations like this. So I want to call people to action, to move past their comfort zones, make a point of getting to know people that are different than you, and pretend like you don't know anything. You know, make a point of exploring the diversity that makes this country so beautiful, and stop being so defensive, and stop feeling like you have to be right, or that your perspective is somehow the superior perspective. And I think that we will really definitely make some progress if people can be encouraged to do that kind of thing.
Dude, that's right on point. Before we go, tell everybody about your Sunday morning show, so that people can tune in.
I'm on my Facebook page, Aaron Tomlinson. I do Sunday morning talks in lieu of, we were still at church when the shutdowns happened, and so in lieu of all that, you know, we couldn't have public meetings, so I started doing these Facebook things, and people enjoyed it. You know, they didn't want to go back to church, and we got a broader audience with that. I also have a YouTube channel I haven't done anything with in a while, but I have a lot of content on the YouTube channel. It's Aaron R. Tomlinson. But I talk about all kinds of stuff, from metaphysical, spiritual, religion, all sorts of things like that. So that's on Sunday mornings, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. And then, of course, it's posted, it's public. So you can find me on Facebook, find me on YouTube. I'm not on any of the other platforms yet, but I'm working on it. So
cool. Aaron, thanks a lot, man. And for everybody that's listening, may you be happy, may you be well, may you be filled with peace. And we'll talk soon.